like
Ew.
sort of,
Sorry about that, Zach. I
oh,
forgot.
no worries. Things like lesson planning, analysis, building relationships that I like enjoyed doing, but really just like the core active teaching, it just was not like, I just like didn't feel like I was that great at it. And so I was kind of in this, well, what am I going to do next situation? And so I guess like a lot of young people, I moved to New York City, and I just tried to get a job. And there was definitely a lot of initially, you're just applying to different things, like looking at education technology. I ultimately landed at an advertising startup, which was just definitely like wasn't like actually seeking out advertising jobs, but it seemed like a cool company. And I landed a role as a technical account manager, which is like a sort of project management / analysis role. I was like working with a lot of clients that were using our software. And that's what I kind of did in tech for my first 2 years, just like in the technology sector. And then from that role, I did a couple different things. So I then moved into solutions engineering, which was still like a technical role, but focused more on the sales cycle. So working with clients before they had signed a contract to work with my company. And then after that, I got into product management. Ultimately, I think I was able to move into product management just because I developed a lot of understanding of sort of the product that I had worked on in both like a pre-sales and post-sales capacity. And then I can talk a lot about like how I think there's no like traditional path into product management, but definitely one I've seen a lot of people make is they'll kind of just like start in a different role, establish just a lot of just sort of like experience, just like working with product teams. And then that can sometimes be a way to just get a foot in the door. And so then I've been doing product management at this point for 5 years. I moved over to Paxos sort of about 2.5 years ago, and have really enjoyed the profession. And so think I'll be sticking with this one for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so I'm going to unpack some of that a little bit. So the first, go back like almost, I'm like, how can't do math, like 8 years ago. And when you made that first transition into the digital advertising company, how did you market your skill set leaving the classroom? Like, did you feel like that was difficult? Did you to connect the dots for folks in a new industry? Did you do some networking and get an introduction? How'd you connect the dots there?
Yeah, so maybe to answer your first question, it was very difficult. Like this process took like multiple months, and there were ultimately a couple key pieces to it. One was I did a lot of networking. I ultimately got introduced like to the company AppNexus that I joined like through a connection, and so I think definitely that's just really helpful when moving industries because other people don't know you, like you don't have like your work doesn't map one-to-one to what the company's looking for. So that was one piece of it. And the other thing that I did was I mentioned earlier this idea of like wanting to work in an analytical role. And I spent so much time like before interviews just like prepping for how am I going to make myself like seem analytical in this interview. People look at teaching and they don't realize that it's a very analytical profession in terms of just like how you have to really think through how you're going to like build out, a lesson plan over like an entire year and then break that down into individual components and tests and all that. And that was sort of like when I went into the interview, I was like, okay, I don't know like how this is going to play out, but I want to make sure that at the very least, it's like they think I'm an analytical person when all said and done. And I think, and then ultimately, I think that is what kind of helped me get over the hump. And maybe to generalize a bit, it was just like mapping like this core sort of capability that I had, figuring out how do I just like connect things I've done in the past to this sort of skill or capability that the company is looking for. And then ultimately just really practicing a lot ahead of time to just make sure that I had that story that I was really confident like sharing it with people in an interview.
I love that. And a lot of the language you're using actually resonates with what we're doing at Lessons Up, right? So you have a group of professionals here. Some folks are looking to make career pivots. Some folks are looking to make vertical moves in their own companies. Some folks are looking for new roles at new companies and new industries. And so hearing that it took you a while to make that transition, that's always like comforting and validating because looking for new roles comes with peaks and valleys of emotions, but also the networking bit that resonates with what we talk about here, as well as, you use language, I wish I could recap. You said like mapping your, I don't know if you use the word competency, but honing in on like, I want to appear analytical to these people and mapping that out in what ultimately ended up being like a career story. I think so. All of that is really incredible, but also resonates with this community in particular. So building off of that, then let's dive a little bit deeper into your role right now at Paxos as a senior product manager, right? So talk to us like we're in fifth grade, although they're probably smarter than I used to think now. What do you do in your day-to-day as a senior product manager at Paxos?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. There's lots of like product manager analogies. I'm going to sort of skip all those. I'm not a huge, there's no one that I'm a particular fan of, but I would just say ultimately what a senior product manager does is you're defining what the product is, and then you're mobilizing teams to make that product successful. And so just to elaborate on like those two things, of like what does that mean more specifically? So the product that I work on now is this product called Crypto Brokerage, which is like a back-end crypto service that companies like PayPal, Venmo, Mercado Libre that have added crypto to their overall application over the past couple of years. Underneath the hood, and like users might not know anything about this, it's like Paxos is actually providing that underlying infrastructure. And my team like build is responsible for building, maintaining, and scaling that software. And so then in terms of, so that's the product I work on. In terms of defining like what that product is, you know, now that the product exists, a big part of it is we're figuring out sort of what's our strategy, what's our roadmap. So essentially for like a given period of time, whether it's a year or a quarter, what are we going to work on? Why are you working on it? What are we not working on? Because that's often like more important to people. It's like all the things you're not doing. And then how are we going to know that we're successful? And that's sort of the product definition piece. And then there's the mobilizing other people piece. And product is, you're ultimately at any company, you're sitting in between a lot of different functions. So at Paxos, it's like I work most closely with engineering, our sort of business development and customer success teams. And then one thing that's cool about sort of product at Paxos, it's different from other sort of companies in the technology industry, is we're also a regulated financial institution. And so I work a ton with our compliance team, our operations team, our finance and information security teams. And ultimately, that sort of definition of the product that I talked about earlier is we have to be able to communicate that in a way that resonates with all those different groups. And obviously, if you can imagine talking to a salesperson versus talking to an engineer, you could say the same thing, but you have to be able to say it in two very different ways. And then ultimately continue to keep everybody moving forward where we're, you know, we have a product, other companies have similar products, we're competing for, you know, similar segments of customers. And so you're constantly trying to balance between, you know, hitting your goals and then just like mobilizing people to get there and just dealing with sort of all of the inputs that go into making that happen.
Oh, I love that. And I forget how smart you are. I can't hit you with the like triple barreled questions. So I'm going to jump around them because you started to hit on what would have been my next question, which are what are the teams you're working with most frequently? But since you separated out your role into two things, which is like that ability to define what the product is, and then the ability to mobilize teams, let's dive a little bit deeper into the latter. So when thinking about your own team, right, what are some of the skill sets that you look for in your team members in order to, you know, move everything forward and define the product? Or even is that something you're doing on your own at Paxos?
Yeah, so I guess maybe there's like two separate ways to answer that. One is just like how do sort of I do that and at Paxos, and then there's like what are the sort of skills that sort of I look for when sort of hiring other product managers onto the team.
Sure. Yep.
So yeah, so I'd say in terms of, so one thing about product management that I think is different than a lot of other like roles of a technology company is it has like the job has manager in the title, but you don't like manage anybody, at least when you like start in the job. So like all these roles like business development, engineering, finance, they all have their own teams, their own functions. And ultimately it's, as a product manager, you're sort of setting a direction, defining like what these teams are going to do, but they don't have to listen to you. Like it's not, you're not their manager. You can't like there's no sort of, and so there's a lot of just like leading through influence. And what I think that, you know, really leads to is you just communicate to a lot of people, whether it's, there's a lot of like written documentation, you're facilitating meetings, you're presenting to people, you're having to, again, sort of say the same thing to a salesperson and engineer and make sure that they both get the same takeaway. And so I think that it's just being able to like communicate to all those different teams, but ultimately with a clear direction in mind. That's something that I think you can be doing product management for like decades and you can never be like done learning in that area, because there's just always, it's like you're always working with different types of people, there's different problems. But that broadly sort of like influential communication is like a really sort of big bucket of what sort of I sort of focus on doing and other people on my team focus on doing in their day to day. And then also when we're hiring other people, a lot of it is just like, looking for experience, just like communicate, breaking down problems, helping just sort of communicate to an engineer, to business development, and just help like creating a really clear picture, because ultimately that's what you're going to be doing, is coordinating a lot of other people and helping them move in a specific direction.
I just heard something from you that I don't think I've heard from any product manager I've ever spoken to. So I don't know if that's like good or bad, but that focus on leading with influence, I think is so powerful and key. I'm curious, like, could you elaborate on that a little bit more without like revealing all of your secret sauce? So like specifically, how do you lead with influence at a company like Paxos?
Yeah, totally. I appreciate the follow-up. I would say, one thing with that is I think, and I've reflected a lot on just like what is my sort of like authentic leadership style as an individual. And I think a lot of what you end up doing is you're like, okay, well, this is like naturally, I like to, think things through, just like get like just like collect a lot of inputs and then just be more just like focus on kind of like connecting the dots and almost just building a really strong sort of like team environment is like my like natural leadership style. And so I think a lot of what I try to do is really just like understand the perspectives of everyone that I'm working with, and then just like incorporate that whenever I'm asking people to do something. But then the other thing is ultimately a lot of like, I'd say my development as a PM has been just like figuring out different ways to like influence teams and influence people. And a lot of it is, I think this is something that like naturally, by like this is like the long-winded nature of this answer is like, I can be like I can explain things like in depth. And sometimes it's like, hey, that works in certain cases and people appreciate the sort of like level of clarity. But in other cases, you just need to tell somebody what to do. And so I think a lot of like leadership for PMs is just figuring out, what is like your natural leadership style and how can you leverage that? But then also as you develop, figuring out scenarios where like, hey, like my natural style isn't a good fit for this situation. I'm going to have to just like adapt and just like flex. And then, you do that more and more. And then you just sort of your natural style kind of expands and you get more comfortable just in a range of like leadership situations.
I love that. So I'm going to jump down to a question I was going to like saving for the end, which is there anything you're reading or that you listen to podcast wise that is keeping you current in your work, or has even in the past, right, help you develop this like leadership style that you're alluding to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I say the majority of like reading podcasts is definitely in the sort of business book, product management, like crypto industry area. And I'd say there's like a mix of like books, Twitter, and podcasts are kind of like the three buckets of things. So maybe I'd say the good news is just like sort of Twitter is an incredible resource for just learning about a PM. And I mean, there's this one guy, Shreyas Doshi, who he was a PM at Google, a PM at Stripe. I think now he's just like a product Twitter like influencer and advisor. But I think I've read all of his tweets over the past 3 years like 4 times, and there's other people like that. And if you ever, my Twitter doesn't have that many followers, but I do like a lot of things, and so if you see, it's mainly product stuff. But there's just a ton of people putting out really great content around like these type, leadership, just like problem solving, rallying people around, an idea. On Twitter, I think podcast, there's like Invest Like the Best is one where they just interview a lot of different founders and actually like investors that I think in many ways, sort of investing is kind of like product management, in that you're making a bet with imperfect information. And then in terms of books, I think like one that I read recently is there was this book, Working Backwards, that was just how Amazon like operates, written by two insiders there. And I found that was just a really like great book in terms of just, hey, well, like Amazon, which is like an incredibly product driven company, like here's how they've done it. And, you know, you can always just learn a lot by emulating companies and people that have been really successful.
Really quickly, because I was trying to capture it too, and I don't want to forget. What was the name of the original product manager you mentioned following from Google on Twitter?
Oh, Shreya Doshi.
Shreya.
Or Shreya,
I
yeah.
mean, Shreya.
And then an S at the end.
And then another second. All right, so we'll drop that at the end as well, because I want to keep going. This is great. That tidbit about Twitter and following PM. So do you notice that that's a thing in your industry, that product managers are using Twitter above any other social to share their ideas and best practices?
Yeah, that's definitely like number one. I would say, I think this whole like product Twitter community really just, I don't know if it like emerged during the pandemic or I started paying attention to it more during the pandemic, but like there's a lot of people on Twitter. Then there's certain people that will, you know, have like Substacks or other blogs that are free. And so I'd say between, if you just like Twitter and then the articles that people link to from Twitter, it's like that like keeps me busy sort of like most of the day if I like just wanted to, you know, read that in my free time. So those are the main, just like Twitter and product blogs, and it's all free, which I think is really great.
That's such a good tidbit. And I just dropped Shreya's name in the chat. So for folks who asked. Okay, so moving right along, I'm like, what do I jump to next? So I already kind of touched on this a bit and you started to allude to it, but curious about your team, right? So you have your own leadership style. Curious as a hiring manager now, so switching the hat a little bit, what kind of people do you look for to fill your team up with that you enjoy working with? And I think I would add to that, as a hiring manager, you know, is your focus on filling a team with like folks that maybe personally might not get the, you know, might not, I don't want to say like might not gel with personality, but will get the job done? Like, what are you looking for? How are you evaluating people that want to join your team? Or is it on, you know, finding that happy medium between skilled and personable, or what does that look like, especially at Paxos in crypto?
Yeah, totally. So, you know, I can speak to it just from the lens of sort of how I think about building out a product team at Paxos, and then the traits that I look for. And I think these traits would likely apply to some level to any role that we're hiring for. And there's definitely, you know, a lot open right now. But I would say in general, you know, because like a product team, ultimately you're responsible for having like a very creative, independent point of view on the business. And so I think it's really important as product teams evolve that you want a real just like diversity of experiences and opinions in there. So like, you know, if I like hire sort of like 3 or 4 other people that, you know, think have similar experiences to me, have similar points of view, then just inevitably we're going to just like miss huge parts of the market, because like, you know, I don't have like an engineering background, I don't have a design background, and like an engineer, a designer, a salesperson will naturally think about problems like differently with still like a product mindset than like I would, for example. And so I think that is just in terms of like, how do you fill out the team is ultimately, I think you do really want like a diversity of experience to make sure that you just have strong coverage of whatever is the sort of problem or product area that your team is focused on. And in terms of specific skills to that, you know, I look for and our team looks for a ton. One is just related to that communication point earlier, but just being able to take a lot of inputs and then make a decision and rally people behind that decision when it's the answer is not clear cut. Because ultimately it's like Paxos, it's an early stage company, it's crypto, things change all the time. And a lot of it is you just do need to be comfortable like making a decision, getting people to move forward in that sort of like ambiguous, unclear setting. And then the other thing is we have this company value called like search for the truth. And I think of that as it's just being able to really get to the real bottom of an issue and develop your own point of view on it, even if it's like the CEO or like your manager, whoever just has like a different view on something, that you can just still like not just take what somebody says and be like it's this, but just really think through the problem yourself. And you know, if your view ultimately is different than the prevailing wisdom, like great, like you should feel confident voicing that.
I love that. And actually you started to answer a question that we had gotten in the chat, which is like, and I added it at the end, but wasn't that clear, which is in a space like crypto that's, you know, emerging and evolving rapidly. How do you hire, right, for these roles? So you did start to touch on that. I maybe like push back a little bit just to get you to give us a little bit more insight. So I feel like I've heard from folks, especially in this community, when they're trying to get into product roles from not a traditional product background, meaning like they don't have product manager on their resume in a title, but they've worked right adjacent to product or in a similar role, like as a project manager. It's actually been difficult to get into the product manager role. So you say like, you know, as a hiring manager, you value diversity and experience, but how would someone stand out, especially if their experience actually is diverse, but they feel like they can do the job?
Yeah, so I would, it's a great question. You know, I would say there one thing, I think it's definitely like a really fair point of just like, especially when you're applying for product manager jobs and you just like on your resume, you haven't had like product manager just like in your past experience. Like that's when reflecting on, you know, when I was like earlier in my career, that was something I'd apply for these jobs, like, oh, product, like that looks fun. People are like, but you have no, like, you've never worked with an engineering team, like how, and the reality is like, once you start doing this stuff, it's like, you can pick it up pretty quickly. So I would say there, you know, maybe two things. One is, I do think that like for a company, like Paxos, I think this applies to a lot of other technology companies as well. It's often a lot easier to just like get a foot, if you don't have a product background, it's just like get sort of in the door at a company in a role that maybe is just like clear cut for your past experience. I think it's reasonable to advocate for yourself and say, hey, like I'm interested in product over the long term. And then just like once you're there, just start to like learn more about the product, connect with the product team. And companies generally have like a culture of like internal mobility, and there's usually ways to move into product from sort of other functions. So that is just like one thing that I say. I think another is there's sort of more certain companies I think have like more just like built out product training programs and are actively looking for people that aren't in like the they don't have a direct product management experience. So I think that's another one. Or I think another thing is oftentimes one thing that I advocate for doing is sometimes people will like be in like there won't be like you'll work for a technology company and like there won't be a like product manager like at your company, and then I'll be like well I'll ask like, well, what do you do? They're like, oh well, like I worked with engineering, I worked with sales. I'm like, oh, so you sort of like did product management. And I think being comfortable saying, hey, like we didn't have a product manager, but I like did X, Y, and Z. And like there's ways that like on your resume you can say like, you know, put sort of like product in the title without saying like product manager, if you don't want to just like misrepresent your role like in terms of a specific like title perspective. At the same time though, you do want to just like advocate for yourself and say like, hey, I did this work and like here's why. I think that is another way maybe to just sort of, I would maybe summarize all of it as it's definitely like it's less clear cut than other roles. But I do think there are different ways that you can like approach it, whether it's just like reframing your past experience, getting a foot in the door, finding companies that explicitly have a training program as just ways to sort of work into product over time.
No, that was fantastic, right? So like even to synthesize for some folks that are taking notes, right? So I think the training program for product managers, the internal program, is something that I just learned today, right? So that's very helpful. To some roles, what we know about, which is like maybe get into a department or on a team that's easier or more clear cut for you to get into and then navigate internally, right? So we know that. And then I think 3, like making sure that we're highlighting our experiences in the way that best serves us, whether that's on the resume and or, through a networking conversation so that you can actually speak to your experiences rather than trusting someone to read it and interpret it the way you want it to be interpreted. And highlighting, I think in general, you've been emphasizing that in product, it is really about mobilizing teams. And there are so many people in various roles at companies that know how to mobilize teams, know how to collaborate cross-departmentally. And if that's you, right, then this could be something that you consider. So how do you tell that story clearly? So I think all of that was actually very, very helpful. Okay, so curious then for you, one thing for some folks in the community, they participate in job search bootcamp. And so we talk a lot about key metrics and being able to define those. And those would be past accomplishments in our careers that we highlight when we're storytelling, right? In kind of those networking calls and in interviewing. So I'm curious about an accomplishment that you're really proud of, whether it's been at Paxos, at your last company, or I don't even know if you go all the way back to teaching. I do sometimes because that was hard work, but curious what you would share about yourself.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would say the sort of experience at Paxos that I'm most proud of, and definitely like up there in terms of just like career accomplishments to date, is just like being sort of like the product manager when we were like building the product to launch our partnership with PayPal, who was really just like our first just like major enterprise customer. And I think what in retrospect was so rewarding about that experience, it was like twofold. One is it's just like the first time you're doing anything as a company. Like there's sort of this phrase like 0 to 1 that you'll sometimes see like written about it in tech, but it's just you just have to like proving to yourself that you can do something. It's just a really fun problem to solve, and it's like there is no path. You have to figure it all out. And I think that in and of itself is just a really like exciting type of environment to be in. And then the second thing was just like the team that I was able to work with was like on this problem. It was just such a great team, and like historically, I've always been motivated by just like who are that like working with really great teams of people where there's like someone in business development, someone in engineering, someone in like even like operations, so where everyone's kind of like playing a different role, and then collectively like the sum is greater than the parts. And I definitely think that like the PayPal experience for Paxos definitely fit that criteria for me. And then ultimately it was also like a really successful one for the company. We a lot of the sort of our Series C, Series D venture rounds, a lot of the customers that we've launched were sort of off the back of that initial launch. And so
Oh, wow.
it was yeah.
That's a big deal. Yeah. So even if anyone goes to Paxos's website, one of their investing companies that they list is PayPal. And so a launch that you worked on also led to that, which is a huge key metric on your point. So yeah, I'm glad you shared that. And so for everyone in the community as well, like what I'm hearing, for all of us is, well, one, you had that brand recognition, right? So we all know PayPal. So if you're working with companies that have brand recognition, that works as well. Demonstrating, and I don't know clearly what your challenge was or the ambiguity that you navigated, but demonstrating that you're like solving a problem is a part of your accomplishment. And then the collaboration with multiple teams to make this happen. And then consequently, like this ended up leading to a much larger story and more fruitful relationship with PayPal that actually drove Paxos's bottom line forward. So that like, if you were in the Lessons Up community, like that key metric would blow like everybody out the water.
Well,
So that was really incredible.
and if I should
Please.
jump in. I mean, I think the sign of a leader is always the person who talks about the team, and I know that if you're the kind of product manager who's showing up and telling a group of strangers that one of the rewards for something that's a big accomplishment in your career was simply the opportunity to work with a team, I mean, I just love that. And it's just great to hear because, all of us are members of a team somewhere. So wanted to just, yeah, shout that out.
I think
Thanks.
that's fantastic too. Yeah. Okay. So yes, amazing. So what I'll do, I'm looking at the time. I want to transition a little bit into some of the more like tactful ways we can approach if someone's interested in this community about Paxos. So first thing I would ask, is there like an internal referral system that Paxos has where if anyone wanted to apply and they had a connection, they could apply that way? And that could just be like a yes or no question.
Yeah, there is.
Okay, so do you have essentially any tips or tricks for getting your resume reviewed at a company like Paxos? And I think before you answer that, like you can answer it very directly, but I also would love to hear a little bit more about the crypto space, right? So how does someone here, if they haven't been involved in crypto or even finance specifically, like how would they market their skill set? Because that's also some gray area.
Yeah, 100%. And that, I was going to address that point first. And so just for context, I talked to a lot of former colleagues that like sort of were in advertising, are still in advertising. And then the first question that I get, and also almost in every interview, is like, hey, I don't have any crypto experience. Is that okay? And like, it's like, yes, it is completely okay. Like this is an incredibly new industry. Like Bitcoin as just like a concept in the world, I think it's only existed for 12 years. So it's just, and that was like, 12 years ago, it was just like a white paper and like nobody was doing anything. And so I think what's helpful is one, I just say to everyone, like it does, like past crypto experience, like doesn't matter. Just like I didn't have any past crypto experience. I had never worked in finance. Ultimately, I think what's helpful is that if you're moving into crypto, is that you've spent some time like reading about the industry, reading about the company that you're interested in, whether it's Paxos or another company, and just thinking sort of for yourself about like what is it about like this company, like why this company within crypto? And as long as you've really like thought that through and like, you can sort of answer it for yourself, I think that's basically sort of like the bar that I think it's worth meeting, but it has nothing to do with past industry experience. And then I would say the other thing is just when, you're looking at certainly for a job at Paxos or another crypto company, I would say like, don't really like look at the title so much at a first glance, but just because these like a lot of these roles just like they didn't exist in past companies. It's this like combination of finance stuff and sort of technology stuff. And you just have to put a label on something to like get a job rec through like a hiring committee. But then ultimately, if you actually like read what they're looking for, and then it just gets back to that sort of like earlier point I was saying about how I got into the tech industry, just like what is the role looking for? And then if you're like, hey, like these sort of core competencies, like I've done that, is just like apply, assuming that it's like an area that like you like doing that work and you want to keep doing it, just apply for the role and just say like, I have X experience and it maps to Y thing that you're looking for.
Love, love, love that. So there was one bit you mentioned, not about the past experience. Oh, this is what happens when it's almost 8 o'clock on my time. That was a good question, building off of what you said. Oh, why the company specifically, right? So with Paxos, do you have any areas where you're like, oh, if you really want to get to know us and what we're doing in this space, like you should read these, right? So obviously there's the website, but I'm curious if like there's one social media platform you all are using to talk about your work more frequently than others. Is there a blog? Should we follow your CEO? Any recommendations on that front? There you go. Thank you for bearing with me while I thought through that.
100%. So I would say the number one thing is our CEO over like the past couple of years has done a number of podcasts, and I've been just, I listen to all of them. And I think he does a great job of just being, really sort of like transparent about sort of like the journey that the company's on and then the journeys that he's on leading the company. And I think so the CEO's name is Chad Cascarilla. If you just like search that in Apple Podcast or whatever your sort of like podcast app is, I think a bunch of things will show up. And I think just listening to one or two of the more recent ones is where I'd recommend anybody start. And there's actually a lot of people that like when you're like, hey, like why do you apply to Paxos? They're like, oh, I listened to this podcast with your CEO, and like got me really interested in the company. And so I think that it's probably an hour of your time would get you like a good sense for, both like what the problem the company's trying to solve, sort of long-term where we see the industry headed, and then just sort of like how like our CEO thinks about like leading and growing the business.
Love that. Okay. And then, so that was very helpful. I have one last question for you, and then I'm noticing questions coming through the chat. I see one hand, and so I will turn it over to the community to ask what else they're interested in. So the last question I would ask is, what is one piece of career advice, whether it's like in the actual space that you're working in as in product, that you've gotten that's been really helpful or guiding in your work, or in general career advice that you think has been guiding in your work?
Yeah, totally. So really love this question. It's actually the advice I have, it's like advice I got when I was a teacher that I think applies really well to product management. But the principal at my school had this phrase that he would just use when he was talking about the school year that was like, start strong, maintain, finish strong. And I always thought, like, when people talk about product management, is like people focus a lot on just like the middle part of your job, which is like when the product is being built. But ultimately, I think where a lot of like values created is on the end. So both like starting strong is like, have you really thought through the problem, like defined a very clear vision for the problem, and then finishing strong is like, have you thought through how you're going to communicate the value of the product to your customers, and really just continue to, after you like release the product, like take feedback and really do the work to make it great. And so yeah, that's one that has always stuck with me, and I found that phrase, you can usually apply it to a lot of other settings as well.
Love that. Okay, let's go to the chat. So, and then I see the hand. Once I'm done going through the question or questions in the chat, then just feel free to unmute yourselves and talk to Zach. So we were asked, you mentioned searching for the truth was a value at Paxos. Can you briefly go over any other values?
Yeah, so we've got four company values, which I think I have them memorized at this point. It's like search for the truth, and then the other three are like sort of be an owner and real-time candor, and then pursue excellence. I'll just quickly speak to one. There's a blog about this on our website. I think we have a lot of information on and we're definitely a values-driven company. But one thing, like sort of that people, I think across whatever role you end up joining the company for, that people really love about Paxos is just like the amount of ownership that you get sort of very early on in your role. And I think we definitely, challenge people to just take on a lot of responsibility and really just, no matter what you're doing, just be a leader, not just in like defining, like, doing your job on a day-to-day basis, but like defining like, how your sort of function can do your job more effectively, how you can sort of like solve a problem for a new type of customer, things like that. And I think that's just ultimately, I think really rewarding for the people at the company, is that you do just have a lot of autonomy, have a lot of ownership in your day-to-day.
I love that. So 4 core values, are they advertised on the website, or is that more internal?
I'm pretty sure they're on their website. I think John, who's on the call, can keep me honest, but we definitely, I remember reading blogs about them when I applied to the company. So they're definitely there.
Okay, but 4 core values, but I love that you focused on, love it. Thank you. It got dropped in the chat, but I love that you focused on one in particular, which is ownership and autonomy. And that's actually something that we can all demonstrate, right, in our like professional materials, whether it's our resume, our cover letter, and then obviously in conversation, being able to talk to ownership and autonomy in projects. Okay, so I think that was the last question, because I like wove in some earlier questions from the chat. So everyone, at this time, we've got about 15 minutes left roughly. If you want to unmute yourselves, introduce yourself to Zach, and ask him a question, feel free to do so.
Hi, Zach. I'm Ariba. I'm a senior in college trying to shift to tech, and I worked in finance this summer. Yes, I'm quite young. And I had a kind of a question. If you're in my position right now, what would be the best route? Like, what would you try out, if that makes sense, to get your foot into product management? I'm sorry. So right now I'm doing a 3-week internship that I sought out myself for a product management role. but like, what is more that I can do to get noticed by companies or get my foot in the door?
Sorry, I think I had to unmute there. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the question. I think that's, incredible that, just like in college, you're like thinking through your career just like in this way. And I would just say, a couple things that came to mind there. One is just in terms of getting into tech. Um, I think even if your sort of first job isn't like in product management per se, if you're at a company that sort of is sort of product focused, product led, talks about themselves as being basically putting products front and center and how they operate, I think that's a good signal. One, that whatever role you do, you're going to be interacting with the product. And then two, it's just like if ultimately, you like working at the company and things can be progressive, like there will be product management sort of like opportunities down the road. So I think that is one, is just like thinking about like, just to throw a company out there, like I think of like sort of like Square as a company that like with like Cash App, and they're just like very like the level of thought that they put into their products, I just think is incredible. And I've like worked with people from Square that are now at Paxos that just like no matter what role they're in, they're just like so thoughtful when asking questions about the product. And so I think just like finding a job at a company that has a really strong product culture, no matter the role, will sort of like set you up for moving into product management down the road. Just if it turns out, like sort of back to my earlier point, I think a lot of just like starting with tech is just getting into the game. Sort of like, I was in tech for like almost like four years before I moved into product management.
Thank you. And I'm getting really discouraged because I'm getting a lot of no's. How did you keep yourself motivated within the month that you weren't a couple months you weren't getting replies or nothing was moving forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it was really tough. I mean, it was basically like a lot of no's. There are certain days where I got like no from like two companies in the same day. You're like, oh man, like you're gonna like space this out a little bit. But I think ultimately, what I kind of like told myself and look back, it just takes one. And like ultimately, having been on like sort of like both sides of the hiring process now, like hiring is just like super like random at some level. And as long as you just like it will work out. It's just a matter of like, just like kind of like sticking with it. And like it was sort of for me, like when I finally like got the job that I ended up taking, it was like at a point where I was like, oh man, like this is like I was like, this is never gonna work out. And then you just like you definitely go through like the cycles, but ultimately, I think just like sticking with it and just knowing that, it's just ultimately like people aren't like no one knows like what jobs you applied for. It's just you get that one, you start that, and then like that sort of like sets up whatever the next step is you're going to take. So that's sort of how I approached it when I was in that situation.
Thank you so much.
Totally.
We had. Oh, go ahead, Megan. Yeah.
Forgot to put it to the right person.
So
Zach, mine's a two-parter. You mentioned like networking definitely helped you move in. So do you have a silver bullet for what is phrasing that helps land those informational or networking conversations, either with the org that you're at right now or just in the space in general? And then the second question, I'll let you answer that and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, so I would say maybe like networking, sort of like two silver bullets. One is I think just to do it. Like I'm naturally like an introverted person, and so I always have to like, no matter how many times it's like I hear people say like networking is important, it's just I have to like like push myself and just like set goals to just like take an action towards networking every day or every week, like whatever makes sense. And then the second one is I think just being like really targeted with the request. Is like there's a lot of people will like reach out and just say like, if you hey, generally like, can you tell me about Paxos first? I was really interested in Paxos's approach to like regulation. I'd love to just like pick your brain on how that sort of applies in like this area. And it's just like that second one, it just, one, I think it shows that a level of thought that you've just like put into like thinking about like why this company. And then second, for the person that you're reaching out to, is you're like, oh yeah, like I can answer that question. Or even sometimes then if you get that question, you're like, hey, I'm not the best person to answer this, but I know somebody who is. And so that makes it easier for them to say loop in like a colleague to actually have like that first conversation with you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, the targeted piece is definitely helpful. And you mentioned that you were an introvert, and just thinking about like different identities, especially just looking around this call, like oftentimes the people that are on this call are traditionally excluded from a lot of tech opportunities and in other spaces. Do you know what efforts Paxos is making to really infiltrate spaces where there are more diverse candidates to ensure there's a diverse candidate pool?
Yeah, so
Sorry, Zach, to put you on the spot, but it's an important question.
It's not targeted at you specifically. It's just trying to understand, like, a lot of organizations are saying that they're seeking diverse candidates, but it's, a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And then also, looking at startup organizations, there's also kind of like this wave of the hand that, well, we don't have to, we're not focused on diversity right now because we've got to get our finances set up and we got to get our product going. And it's, all the excuses. So just trying to figure out where orgs are dipping in.
I'm sorry, I had to, because Megan, I loved that question. And the answer really is right here. It's people like Zach saying, yes, I'm going to show up. And I mean, look around our room, it's so diverse. I just love it. But I also, of course, I want to let Zach talk about diversity and inclusion, but I just wanted to jump in and say, like, we're living it right here. And so, Megan, I love that question.
And Zach, I'll just add in a little bit because I'm looking at the time, and I'm realizing a question that wasn't necessarily asked earlier that would, I think, help. If you want to talk a little bit more about Paxos's culture, right? Like, what is it actually like to work there as well? If you can, maybe answer that better, but I think Megan's question absolutely is important and relevant for the community as well. So whatever you can answer.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, one, thank you for the question. I definitely, personally, I think diversity and inclusion is very important to me. It's very important to Paxos. I would say, one thing that I think we've tried to do as a company is just really, participate and lead a lot of initiatives that just like enable more people from less represented groups to get just like develop more awareness of crypto. So like we sponsored just like a women in blockchain event and have done a lot of like introductory sort of courses for people like with that group specifically to just understand and kind of like demystify crypto a bit. And so I think that's one area where we're focused as a company. I'm sure there's definitely a ton more that I'm missing. And then I would say, more broadly, Michaela, in terms of the culture, I think Paxos, it's a very just like open, collaborative, really just like engaged culture. I think back to that sort of like earlier point of like ownership. I think a lot of people, like when I like, reflect on my own experience or when I talk to, what about Paxos, like, do you really like? It's like that people, one, they have ownership over the job. Two, they like love who they work with. They love their team. Our teams are, it's like an increasingly diverse team sort of like over time. It's a highly sort of like agile problem solving setting. And then lastly is people are able to like be themselves. And so we've got all these, like there's Slack channels on like cooking, on parenting, on the metaverse. And so when I think of all of that, it's like ultimately, I think we're creating a culture where, whoever you are is like, you can just like be yourself in the work. Like you can work with people that, are similarly motivated to you, that will kind of like tell it like it is. And it's like, sort of like can be an intense workplace, but that ultimately everyone is like solving a problem together. And I think that I think culture makes it a great place to work for people, like regardless of your background.
I have a very specific question because you emphasize workplace. Are you completely hybrid? I mean, are you completely remote? Are you hybrid? Is all of Paxos remote? I'm curious about that piece as well to share with the community.
Yeah, so we are remote first. I think all of our jobs, with a few like specific exceptions, are like open to remote work. We do have offices in New York, London, and Singapore. And so I would say if you know are in New York and like want a place with an office, but also want to work remotely, like that's an option. But in an increasing percentage of our employees are just joining just from states like throughout the U.S. So yeah, very, and the company, as you can imagine, has just done a ton to really build like a remote first like culture and an environment that's conducive to like working from all over the place in an effective way.
Okay. And then to wrap up, I think, Tammy, I saw your hand earlier. So if you still had a question, feel free to ask, and then I'll close out.
Sure. It's my name's Tammy Joe. I recently as product director for a virtual events platform. So getting to leverage some of my experience as an event manager into a technical space was very interesting. And I discovered there that, you know, the technology space is moving so rapidly. And recently I went down the rabbit hole of, you know, buying my first NFT and doing all of that. And it moves at such a rapid fire pace that I think that's one of the biggest inhibitors for a lot of people moving into it. And I love how PayPal and Venmo have jumped into that space to really kind of allow for more folks to have access. So my question kind of is centered around the users, right? When you're really thinking about the user, who are you really looking at when Paxos is looking at their products and looking at the work that they're doing?
Yeah, well, I guess as a product manager, I love sort of ending the interview with a question about users. So thanks for that. And maybe before I answer that, just one point that you brought up just around like NFTs and all the sort of like innovation going on in the crypto space is one thing I'll often say is like the rate of change and innovation in like crypto and blockchain, it's unlike anything that I've seen in my career. And so even if, you know, you were like the world's expert on like cryptography and knew everything about the industry and the technology today, in 6 months, like your knowledge would be largely out of date. And so I think like what, you know, you're talking about just like really just engaging with a part of the industry that's like appealing to you, like whatever that is, I think is a really, you know, great way to just get in the game, so to speak. And then to answer your question about users, so Paxos, our product is we're focused on a B2B2C, or like with that we're serving businesses that ultimately serve end users. So like our sort of customer is PayPal, but our product gets used when a user of the PayPal app takes like an action to buy or sell crypto, for example. And so when I think from a product management perspective, that it's like really, it can be really engaging work because there's sort of like 2 or 3 different perspectives that you have to take. One is the perspective of ultimately like who is the end user that is like doing something in the world with crypto, and like how do we enable that experience? Because if we don't do that, then like, you know, you have nothing. Then there's sort of a level down from that. There's sort of like the developer as the main user of our platform, and ultimately it's like developers at companies like PayPal are building products using our platform. And so it's like from that lens, I'm like, oh, how do we know what the end user wants to do? How do we make it as easy as humanly possible for developers to build and then reliably scale like an application that enables, you know, them to hit like their users to do things that help their company hit their business goals. And then the last piece is there's also sort of like users like treasury and compliance users that are like the back office to these companies. And most, you know, fintech apps have huge like, you know, sort of back office operations that are a mix of their own sort of internal products as well as teams and process. And a lot of what we're building increasingly is there's like, how do we build sort of the product that sort of faces the end user? But then there's also how do we build the other side of that product that enables both our team and our customers' teams to support the end user. So it's, I guess it's like a couple of different pieces, but ultimately you have to do all that in a way that is like sort of cohesive and you can deliver on like a timeline that works for the company.
I love that. And that brings us right, like we're right on time and making me realize like we could have a much larger conversation about like what is social equity mean for crypto moving forward. Even right now, like it's moving so fast. Bitcoin is, I can't afford Bitcoin, who can? And so like, what does that mean about the space? And I also think those questions are great questions to bring to interviews, right? If you interview at companies like Paxos, like, what do you think about this in this space? It's an interesting conversation that can continue. But with respect to everyone's time, and I noticed someone asked a question of Zach in the chat, so I just dropped my email again. If you want to follow up with Zach or if you want to connect with him, I ask that you reach out to me first so that Zach knows that you're folks that came from this call, and we can figure out the best way to connect with him with respect to his schedule. But in general, Zach, I mean, it was wonderful hearing about your experience. Really proud of where you've ended up. And thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone else. And we'd love to hear about your reactions on LinkedIn and in Slack to this conversation. We'll be posting, and Paxos would love to be tagged. So if you're interested, make sure you follow up there, and we'll see everyone soon. But thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michaela, and thanks for having me, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Scan through the chat. And Zach, I'm actually going to call you because I want to just follow up really quickly, but we have a call at 8. Like there's another boot camp about to hop in here.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, but I'm gonna call your phone.
Cool. Thanks.
Night, everyone, or have a good afternoon. Awesome.